This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Pratt. I'm formerly from South Africa, and I relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellowship in beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Today, our thoughtful bold leader joins us from the economic hub of Johannesburg in South Africa. He started his adult life as an airplane pilot, including aerobatics, and then became a corporate commercial executive before moving into academia. He is currently the Dean and Director of Henley Business School Africa, part of the Henley Business School of the University of Reading in the United Kingdom. The school has campuses in Europe, in China, in Malaysia, and Africa. It has been accredited more than 4 times, and it is one of the oldest business schools in Europe. He is a board member and board chair of the Association of African Business Schools, a visiting professor in strategy, creativity, and innovation, and also a member of the faculty of the University of Cape Town Graduate School of Business, where he designed and launched their MBA and executive education programs. His international career has taken him across the globe. He has lived and worked in the United Kingdom, in France, in New Zealand, and South Africa, harnessing more than 35 years of international experience. Stay tuned as he shares more with us about the lasting value of kindness and paying it forward. Why musicians, journalists, and sports stars, often fueled by tragic optimism, do well in the MBA. Collective intelligence, and also why Nelson Mandela's anger inspired him. We warmly welcome my dear friend and colleague, John Foster Pedley, and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. John, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm delighted to be having this conversation with you. What struck me right up front is your colorful career from a professional commercial pilot into the executive business world, working internationally, and then, of course, into academia in your current role. What for you is the common thread?
Thank you, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here. And for me, I think it's more like a triple helix of, curiosity, restlessness, I think empathy. And I'm hesitant to claim empathy for myself because we would all like to be empathetic. I don't think I am very empathetic sometimes, but I think when we have empathy, it matters. And so that curiosity about the world and the restlessness of not being quite satisfied with oneself, which is partly what curiosity does to you, is important. I think those are the key elements.
Yeah, and when you say the restlessness, can you expand on that a little more? I mean, what was the restlessness that took you literally out of the skies into the commercial world and then onto academia?
I think flying is a wonderful career. It's very precise. It's very interactive. You're very in tune with the elements. And it's very analytically clear, and you're working with lots of instruments, and there's a certain flow that goes with it. What academia gives you is an intellectual flow, is the satisfaction of looking at abstract objects and seeing how they connect with the real world. So flying gives you the real world, academia gives you the sort of big picture, but business or running a business school brings it all together. And that you're trying to make abstract ideas work in the concrete world for the common good.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was quite taken with the positioning statement, if you like, of Henley Business School. I know it's connected to Reading University, and perhaps you can expand a little more on the size and scope of the business school. And when you do that, I'd be curious to know what prompted the positioning of Henley as building people to build businesses that build Africa.
Well, we are part of a large university in the UK called the University of Reading, and Henley Business School is one of the oldest business schools in Europe. So Henley is 75 odd years and is part of this big university. That university has campuses around the world. It's got several campuses in Europe. It's got campuses in a campus in Malaysia and activities in China, in the UK, and also Africa, which is 30 years in the making. And that international university, which is not just triple accredited, but now the first in Africa to be quadruple accredited, which is accredited by the African Association of African Business Schools, has a purpose. And you would think an international university might come with its knowledge to distribute it to the world. And it's probably the most evil aspiration of a university. I think what you must come is to a society, understand what that society needs to grow and thrive, and use your knowledge to support it, not try and tell. Because the adaptation of that knowledge to that local context and local requirements is the key art of a good university. It's not maintaining some global academic distance, it's creating a local entrepreneurial, academic supported impact.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just in terms of the purpose, why is the emphasis in your school building the people? And when you say the people, very often in business, people talk about people are our most important assets. But when you look at the reality on the ground and how many organizations treat people, in their day-to-day conduct, behavior, values, policies, etc., there isn't necessarily an alignment between what those organizations say and what is happening on the ground. Why do you believe it really is about building people? And what do you think differentiates those organizations that truly do emphasize building their people?
You call people assets, and of course that's one way to look at them. People might object. I might object to be labeled as an asset. My daughter might object. I think as peoples, we are complex contributors to a purpose. And I think that what makes a great organization work is a purpose that resonates in the context, not some thing that's a mission statement that people will see, in a book for the sake of it. But in South Africa, we have a very big difference between rich and poor people. In South Africa, we have a damaged historic path through impact of colonialization, extracted wealth being taken over overseas, not much being left behind. And then, of course, in South Africa, apartheid. And more recently, post-1994, is state capture and the massive corruption we've been through. So there's a number of things that deal with that. Behind all that are the people that educators should educate. And whether you're a business school or a university, what we need to do is grow people for something. And you could say, out of my way, I'm an MBA, I'm the smart person in a room, and it's about positioning. In these societies where you've got the highest Gini coefficient in the world, great gap between rich and poor, very capable people, many of whom don't believe they are, but when they're educated, have an epiphany and a burst of self-confidence that lets go their talent that's been choked. In those societies, a business school is about building confidence, getting people's intellectual and practical activities going, allowing them to get used to their imposter syndrome and their own senses of insecurity, and giving them the confidence to try things out, build organizations, and therefore build the economy. And that's what a business school should do.
Yeah, that's very compelling. I'm curious, in your own life, you talk about building self-confidence. What was the tipping point in your own young life, John? And I know you spent part of your childhood in the United Kingdom and, of course, some of it in Malaysia. But can you take us back in time to a moment that was more difficult for you?
Well, often when people are asked, when was a difficult moment? I think, they struggle to find one. I just have so many through life that seem difficult. And I wonder if most people don't as well. A sense of epiphany, I think. I was brought up in the family of a war hero, a sort of Second World War fighter ace, military but service-orientated family, apolitical. And I think there were early epiphanies in the sense of doing it for yourself and having self-reliance and being able to take on a little bit of problem, aggro and pain was important. I remember that. I remember a very important epiphany in my life when I decided to leave the Royal Air Force and grow my hair and travel around Europe and the world for a while. And that was very scary to leave that background and launch myself off to an entirely uncertain future. But coming out of that, where I decided to work my way back into flying by doing all sorts of jobs, selling things and cleaning airplanes and many, many things, become a flying instructor and borrowing money from the bank and really building your own career again from nothing because I put it behind. That was an extremely powerful moment for me when nobody was supporting me. I had very little, but you push to make it happen. I hope everyone has that experience because it teaches you that in spite of your own obvious liabilities, well, most of us have, maybe you don't, but I imagine we all do, yes, that you can do things if you have the will. I suppose that sounds a bit trite, but I think that's a very strong epiphany for everybody, that sense that you really must try.
How did you feel at the time?
So I think I felt at the time fear and remarkable sense of adventure, which I think has always inspired me. I have a very strong sense of adventure and a sense of growing capability of all these sort of negative and positive emotions coming together, but driven by a sense that you have to really make your own destiny, actually. And that for me was important.
Yeah. What was the point? What was the light bulb moment? When did the light bulb come on for you during that time, when you understood that there was a new and different way to navigate past that moment?
This is going to sound silly, but I had no money at all, and I was a flying instructor living somewhere on nothing. And I walked into a bank, Barclays Bank it was, in Jersey.
Where were you?
I was in Jersey in the Channel Islands. Okay. And I walked into this very, very big bank. I think I had a guitar, a toolbox, and a few clothes to my name. And I was in my late 20s. And I went to the manager and I said, "Mr. Berman, can I borrow some money?" And he said, "Well, yes. What's your collateral?" And I said, "What's collateral?" He said, "Well, your property." I said, "I have none." And there was something in that moment where Mr. Berman looked at me and I looked at him, where for absolutely no reason in the world, he decided to give me lots of money to do my flying instructor's rating. He didn't even know me. And then I went back to him more. There was something about doing that and the kindness and that moment of him doing it that stayed with me forever. Why on earth did he do that? I understand it now because I do it for other people. I give a lot of scholarships away. And sometimes there's a moment. Yeah. I was in an Uber the other day and there was this Uber driver called Rais Mohammed and we talked. And it turns out that he'd given his life, he'd gone into Yemen, he'd spent a year studying deep religious philosophy, came back, was an entrepreneur, and there was something magic about him. And I couldn't help but give him a scholarship to study, and he's just thriving. And I suppose sometimes you recognize that in other people. And if you respond to the instinct, you do good in the world. And that person did good for me, Mr. Berman, God bless him.
Did you ever go back and have that discussion with him and the significance of that impact? I'm just curious.
I wish I could. It was a long time ago, but I try and tell that story as often as I can because there are many Mr. Bermans out there. And I then, flying is a hard game. You have to work pretty hard and you go all over the world. And I then went to South Africa to fly and bush fly and instruct and be an airline pilot. And I never got back to him. I never got back to Jersey for years. I really should have done. I expect he's passed on, but I would like to have done.
Yeah, but you certainly acknowledge him as you're doing right now. I mean,
Yes. And there was one other person like that, a man I used to work for called Tom Saunders with British Aerospace. He was an ex-pilot. And I don't know if you've ever watched that television program, Absolutely Fabulous. And it's about Eddie and what's the name, Edwina and I can't forget. But it's a fantastic program. Well, Jennifer Saunders was Tom Saunders' daughter. So he used to talk about that quite a lot. But he was my boss in British Aerospace, and I decided I wanted to do an MBA. And so I'd leave British Aerospace. And for some reason, he said, no, don't leave. And he sponsored me for one of the most expensive MBAs in Europe at the time, with full salary and full payments, and completely changed my life. And why did Tom Saunders do that? There's no reason, but somehow he did. And so we, I think, have the largest scholarship program of any business school in Africa now. And I'm continually giving money away to people I think will grow into leaders. And whether they're in the creative arts, like music or drummers or activist journalists or sports people, where we give them to NGO workers, whatever it is, we give these scholarships away without rhyme or reason, because we think these people somehow feel they're going to become examples and build industries, rather than just build themselves. There's a sort of natural affinity to those sort of people that helps us do it. And I think we all have that affinity. I think that we all try, and I think, you know, the world and the pressures of making business and being important and being a leader will tend to distract you from that. But I don't think I'm a good leader at all. And there's plenty of people who say I'm terrible, I'm sure. Other people might be kind enough to say I'm good. And I think that's how it is. But what I do know is that leadership is about building other people.
And, you know, on the point, John, around that instinct, when you say for no rhyme or reason, I'm sure there was a rhyme and reason. And in the same way, when you see that in other people, what is it that you see in people when you say, I have a feeling about this person. This is a person I want to invest in, support, because I believe they're people who will build businesses and build, you know, make an impact. What is it you see? What is it you think people need to cultivate to attract that kind of energy, if you like, for want of a better expression?
This is going to sound terrible, but it's not really scars, but a sort of instinct to be willing to take on some scars for something bigger. It's an instinct to struggle. There's a light in the eyes, which is not just a self-obsession. It's a sense, and it probably comes from people being hurt sometimes. It's a sense that, I've been through this. I recognize that people are not perfect, that no leader is perfect. You know, in fact, imperfection is a really important thing to embrace in your leadership. And if you don't, plenty of people will tell you about it. But in spite of that pain, that you have to push on in life. And I think Viktor Frankl talked about it a lot in that book, In Search of Meaning, when he talked about tragic optimism. Pushing through hard times for something better. It's not the evasion of hard times. It's a willingness to endure some really quite rocky times in your own life, and to accept the ups and downs of life, but continually know that if you are motivated to purpose, you push it forward, you are very likely to get far further than you could imagine. And therefore, letting go of what you imagine you can be and continually frightening yourself is probably a very good strategy.
Yeah. That's a pretty interesting thought, and just an interesting process. Is that a process you went through when Mr. Berman invested his faith in you?
Well, yes. I mean, you know, I didn't automatically. I mean, I was lucky that I'd had evidence that flying was a thing that came reasonably easy to me, and I carried on, and I did a lot of aerobatic flying later on, and I loved all that sort of thing. But I think when somebody is committing to themselves and committing to the world, I think you recognize that. And you recognize, like I say, you recognize the willingness to go into the harder times of life for the sake of something great. And when you see that in somebody, it's almost impossible not to help them. When you see people holding back and covering and whatever, yes, of course you want to help them. But there are some people who are willing to take on the challenges and pain of life for something really, really big. And those are the people who are going to drive progress and will drive businesses. And not all people like that, because there are many types of leaders. You need leaders who are very methodical. You need leaders who are good in stability. But you also need people who will generate change, the provocateurs. And the big thing about being a provocateur is that it sounds very sexy and exciting. I want to be a provocateur, but you can never be a provocateur if you think it's sexy and exciting. It's a painful process, but the pain is well worth the effort in terms of self-realization and the sense of, you know, you've escaped from the bigger limitations of yourself into something. And as you grow, you should never really feel you're great. In fact, I think as you grow, you really come to realize how ordinary, how deeply ordinary you are. And that ordinariness is actually a powerful thing. Why do we all want to be so extraordinary? We are gifted with more than everything we need to do well in life, just as we are as ordinary people, if we apply it.
To that point, John, I get that there are many different types of leaders, and of course there are probably, there's a plethora of different kinds of leadership models and frameworks. But in your, having bridged a professional, a commercial, and an academic life, what is your definition of leadership?
Leadership is defined by a cause. For me, I'm a late dad, and I have a 17-year-old girl and a nearly 16-year-old boy. Yeah. And I don't know if you're a parent, but a lot of people will be who are listening, I suppose. I think that something happens then. You then start to want to do something for them, and by extension, all those other children in the world and the society that is behind you. It's not because you're noble or pure or a saint. It's like it's just like a deeply hardwired instinct in you that you should respond to for the world. Yeah, and you shouldn't be so terrified of it that you want to acquire everything, because the acquisition of having a mission is far greater in the end than the acquisitions of being, just building an entity or something. So it's scary, but it's worth doing. And funnily enough, there's probably more stability in having a mission than there is in having a lot of property. It's certainly a little bit more scary, I would say, but that's just for me, and I wouldn't presume for an instant to say what it is for somebody else.
You mentioned earlier the importance of imperfection, and so often people in powerful positions, which are often confused with leadership because they may or may not be the same thing, but it's hard for people, depending on the culture, to show their vulnerable, imperfect side. What for you do you think is the value of understanding and also exposing our imperfections?
I think if you don't expose your imperfections, you're doomed to live in a facade or an artificial environment. I don't think it's because you're trying to be noble or humble when you expose your imperfections. I think if you're trying to lead, your imperfections stick out all over you. And they come out. And if you try to manage that and hold them down and create this wonderful image, it's not something that another human being can really deeply, they can resonate with the fantasy of that, but they're never going to resonate as a human being about it,
Sure.
So you can't actually do good work without pushing yourself to the limits quite often. And when you push yourself to the limits, your other side shows, maybe it's your dark triad, your tendency to sociopathy or neurosis or narcissism, all of which in modicum amounts have a beneficial aspect, but in extreme, they're not. And so those things will pop out. You have to, if you really want to lead well, and you want to lead on a major scale, not just for an institutional organization for profit, which is a contained form of leadership. I mean, imagine if we were really passionate about the environments and the world we're living in, the climate, and we had to think, this is our biggest thing we have to do. How do we lead in that? What do we give up? And actually, there is a calling in there that we all have to respond to, all in different ways. Doesn't mean you've got to give up your career, but you certainly have to look forward. You have to think beyond the consequences of the profit of a company, the boundary of a company, into society, the impact you have on society. And you have to know that that's not acceptable, that I should be part of doing that. And then face the horror of the fact that there's very little you can do, and it's great impotence, but you've still got to do something, and just start doing it. And I think that is a really important part of leadership these days, that you've got to stand out, you've got to be vocal, and not be embarrassed or humiliated because it's so insignificant when you look at somebody else who's done so much. Everybody started with that. And if everybody gets on that path, then we will make those positive changes in society that will make a world that's a little bit more livable, save the climate a little bit more, save the species a little bit more, have the seasoned nature that we want our children to experience and feel part of in a really deep connection, as well as building great enterprises, great science, great institutions, understanding what democracy and other ways of management mean, and exploring humanity. And that's a big part of what we do. And we shouldn't separate ourselves from those big ideas because we're in a business or we're in an institution. Those things should be serving something beneficial in the world. And I think we need to be part of, in our very small ways, of looking for the real benefit that whatever we do does in life. And please not be trapped by just making material benefit for ourselves, because surely we don't want our children to live like that. Why should we want to live like that, you know? That sounds like a lot of truisms and whatever, but it's you know, I think it's the world we're facing. We have to take some action.
Yeah, but the truth is, John, there are also a lot of people sitting in powerful positions that have been very successful in kind of, you know, presenting the facade, and sometimes it's very risky to break through the facade for people, depending on the culture of the organization. So for those that have witnessed the success of people, what would you say to them about, you know, packaging this veneer of so-called perfection? What would you say to those people, given that it appears to be successful and they seem to have all the trappings of success, albeit very often more material in the material world? What would you say to those people?
I think it's very difficult to generalize. One of the things about when you become more senior in what I think, and I can't speak for people who have broader scope ideas than I do, is I think you realize that you didn't realize how complicated things were until you get there. So it's very easy to project a simplified view of life onto leaders or management and trivialize them as demonic or polarize them in a sort of Manichaean way of black and white. Actually, a lot of people are dealing with enormous levels of complexity. And when you're dealing with those levels of complexities in senior positions, it's very, very hard to find the right decision. And what happens is you've got to make some decisions in the face of enormous uncertainty. And so the consequences for potential disaster are much greater, you know, and therefore you have to have a sense of accountability of yourself. So while that will attract some people who are pathologically not very pleasant, it will attract a lot of people who are pathologically very, very driven and very positive in life. And I think we tend to underrate that. You know, it's very hard to understand what it's like to be in a very senior position till you've been there. And the trade-offs and the balances you have to make. It's a bit like watching a Netflix movie in terms of all the things you have to go on. So I think one has to realize that if you are going to go into senior position, it's going to be learning, and you're going to have to take on some really big decisions, which are not going to leave you comfortable. And that means that you won't be popular sometimes, and that's a hard thing for most people.
You know, in this current very turbulent world we're living in, what in your mind, from a strategic point of view, do you think are the biggest kind of leadership challenges and opportunities today? And I know that's a broad question, but within your world, within your sphere of influence, what do you think are the big challenges that people are faced with?
We're living in a world that we are trying to make better and panicking about it. And for some reason we should panic because now the tools we have and we're making are more powerful and potentially more destructive, but of course, more able to do things as well. I think it's incredibly important to have a measured optimism. I think cynicism is a great failure of perception, real chronic cynicism. It's looking at the world and that beautiful picture behind you will be dark, and the ducks and the things will be like monochrome, and it like looking at life through a very depressive state in some ways, and also trivializing people. Of course, everybody has base motives, but everyone has noble motives too. So I think what we have to do as leaders is to stop trying to find sanity and security just in the boundaries of organizations. But as you become a leader, you get deeper sense of causality. You're pulling bigger levers with more uncertain outcomes. But if you can pull the right combination of the big levers, you get massive positive effect. And so one of the things that leadership needs to do is have big ideas for the world, but not get lost in those big ideas, because the moment we do that, the most important thing, which is, you know, I'm here talking to you and you maybe have a family, I have a family, don't we want to get back to them? You know, that's, you know, holding those thoughts as well. Bringing the human being and the personal human being into the world of business is also important, but not in a way to debase it, because business serves that. So I think the big challenges for leaders are being human, developing their minds to see big ideas, understanding that most of the big decisions are somehow collective. You know, you will see the world in such a sophisticated way that's different from mine. And imagine if we could connect both our perceptions to a great big brain hanging up there, and another 10 people in Boston and a couple in London. Imagine the wisdom in that brain if we could connect those multiple but different insights. That collective mind, that collective thinking has much deeper, richer understanding of a context than any of our individual ones. And so I think good leaders have to start getting that collective insight going.
Yeah.
There's a law in Denmark called the law of Jante, which means John's law, which is all about the power of ordinariness. You know, I cannot be greater than the group, because how can my individual perception be better than the group's perception? It's a very strong, powerful view. And I think leaders need to do that. I also think we have to be very articulate. I think you need to be very technically capable. You need to have good financial acumen. You need to be a pretty reasonable psychologist. And you need to almost have the spiritual insight of a devout monk. So of course, none of that's really going to happen, but we need multiple capabilities, some of which are very clear and linear, and some of which are really much more about understanding the world as it could be, not seeking a fugue away from politics and big geopolitical issues in the narrowness of a particular institutional leadership role.
You know, John, I mean, that's an interesting combination. And, you know, a friend of mine the other day was saying, you know, even using the word, you know, spiritual in the world of business is often virgin territory for many. What would you say to group chief executives and company executives that haven't navigated into that more metaphysical space? How would you approach that?
Look, I don't think they haven't navigated there necessarily. I think what happens is the world and education drives people away from it very often. So the great late Clayton Christensen, who was a strong, you would know up the road, he was a very strong Mormon Christian, a very powerful faith and a brilliant strategist. There's other people I know who are devout Muslims or Hindus or other forms of Christianity who have that belief system. For some of them, that religion is a barrier, is a blockade to thinking. For other people, it's a liberation. And I don't think there's anything wrong in thinking about spirituality in business anyway. I mean, I think the language of business has naturally become about, you know, agency and finance and investment. Those are really, really important things. But why would investment or that beautiful building behind you or looking after that lake, which somebody is doing, be somehow unspiritual? I think we mystify the spiritual thing. We create this sort of domain of, as if you're in there in some transcendental position. I think any one of those people would tell you that spirituality is a very average, very normal, very real sense of presence and a sense of something more than you are, which you can live with day in, day out. You don't have to be lost on a mountain to do that. It's just presence. It's just being there. And it's not trying to be noble and glorious. Most of the time it's grappling with your demons, which, you know, when you push yourself into leadership, your demons are there and you have to overcome your ego. You have to and you will make big mistakes sometime and you will be called to account, but you've got to carry on in spite of it.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's anything weird about putting spirituality in business. I think the way we describe spirituality is the problem, you know.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm curious, in your commercial executive life, I know you've lived and worked, I think, on 6 different continents, and you've held senior executive positions in sales and marketing. Can you take us back to a specific moment in time when you were dealing with a really tough challenge within your environment. And what was that occasion, and how did you navigate out, particularly understanding the importance of having to build the people to help work through and solve the problem?
Yeah, I think there's a number. I think my more recent experience at Henley is an example. We
Okay.
started with 5. We've grown into a pretty powerful business school that's been accredited on its own right. And we've done it with no investment. We were technically insolvent when we started and had a lot of debts I didn't know about. And we built it entirely with no investment, no loans, no subsidies, into a thriving and powerful business school. And we've done that through COVID. You know, we switched in COVID to fully online. And I think that required a lot of change. And so for that, we created a model using system thinking about how we would build an enterprise. And the first thing in us, we would have to define our context. We would have to redefine what Africa means, away from the world's definition into something that's more full of potential. We would then have to make purpose our driving force before we even thought of money. And that would attract talented people to us. And we would have to create that community. We would have to teach them how to design great education using different design tools and different methods to create education that actually had an impact, made people better at doing something rather than talking about it. When they were better at doing something, they would try it out and get confidence, and they would say, oh, that's pretty good. And the moment they were confident, they would get results, and that would make them even more confident. At that point, people would notice them and say, well, where did you get that from? And they would say, oh, you got it from Henley. And then people will come to us because of that. So most people, you try and drive at the top end of that, but you've got to work out what are the systemic drivers, the 3 or 4 systemic drivers of your business model really work. And part of that was dealing with people in a certain way, was building people's confidence, but also being very candid and being actually quite dispassionate about human capability, looking somebody in the eyes and seeing them for the capability that they believe they had, and actually not being very sympathetic at all, and just saying, you know, I'm not listening to your imposter syndrome or your self-generated sense of you can't do it. Here we learn to do it, and I've got great feeling for you, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time with you and your sense you can't, because actually time isn't on our side, and we actually have to really get good at doing things. And so we push people like that. And I think that's created a dynamic and a sense of honesty and a sense of, and it's often very conflictual, that has created an organization that mostly works, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I'm the problem, sometimes we're not. That's how it is. I think that sense of having of engaging people candidly to what they can do, and a sense of what people can do, is a critical thing in development. We tend to work with an abstract idea, a talent framework, or a whole set of competencies which we don't fully understand. Here, we want people to be better at business straight away, try it out and see results straight away, because our society can't support less than that. And that creates a sort of a dynamic that is almost scarily performative.
Interesting. And the 3 to 4 kind of strategic levers for Henley?
We care. And that's not a bleeding heart sort of care. We care when we have a lot of issues that are coming up. I mean, I won't share with people who are sick or whatever. We engage with that. We don't try and hide it.
Yeah. And in those tough moments, John, just very briefly, what you know, we all have those days where it's more difficult to kind of push through. What has been the impetus during those particularly tough moments to kind of push through and keep the faith strong, and just a sense of I can, you can, we can? What has been the impetus to get through those more difficult barriers?
Well, I'm of an age that I was born just after the Second World War with a father who went through the war. And in England, I remember, you know, it wasn't very easy for many years. I wasn't conscious of it, but it was just a way of being that you don't have a lot of luxuries, even though I'd born into a middle-class family with much. We were also a family that would make you do things. And I think that early conditioning of that you have to somehow push on and carry on, you can't easily give up. Conditioned also by the loss people had in that Second World War was very powerful for people. I mean, I think that the lucky ones would have got a benefit from that, although a loss too. And I think more recently, we've got actually much bigger problems facing us. We've had, until Ukraine, we've had very little invasions of other countries by major powers. Now we're sitting on a different idea. But we have climate, we have social dissipation, we have the potential of so many challenges facing us now with wildlife, that why would we not engage with that if you are of an age? You don't give up when you're 60 or 70 or 50 and say, I'm going to leave the next generation. That's just when you're most needed. That's just when you need to show leadership and show up and put yourself on the line, actually, because you are now setting the scene for your children and generation to come.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very normal, it's not a heroic thing at all. I just think it's deeply hardwired into us. We should act like that. So I think that leaders now need to understand and serve the generations that are coming forward, and not their own generation. Just understand that that's not what you're here for. You know, we actually have to make a change on the world, and we've got to step up into it. And that's really scary, mainly because we mostly feel so insignificant and useless and fraudulent and self-inflated in our importance by trying, why me? How can I have those aspirations? But actually, if you look behind you, there's nobody else. So you might as well have a go. And I think we are in that phase now that, yes, we build institutions, we make our careers, we do our arts, we build our families, but actually we're living in a world that needs our attention. And unless we put our attention to that world, it's not going to change. And that, tiny though it is, we need to keep collectively making that effort. Even though we might stumble or get it wrong, we have to try. Whatever that means to you, in whatever way that means to you, make the effort. And the rewards of doing that will not be great glory or affirmation from other people, will be quite an important sense of dignity and self-worth, and pain. And pain comes with achievements, and you must never try and avoid it, I think.
Absolutely.
That's not a very good gospel, is it? I mean, nobody's going to do that, but it is kind of what it is, you know?
Yeah. Well, as a former chairman of mine once used to say to me, you know, no pain, no gain in life. You know, kind of growing pains. You know, growth comes with its pain. It's kind of part of. But there's also, I think, the paradox of that when we have the darkness, you know, the light looks so much lighter. It's sometimes we need that contrast to appreciate the better times, and so it's an interesting perspective. Just kind of shifting gear a little, John, around just some fun facts about yourself. I know you love playing the guitar. What brought you to the guitar, and what's your favorite place to play?
I think other people's favorite place for me to play is far away from them, but no, I've been trying to play for many years, and I think being a very average guitarist is a gift, because it teaches you great appreciation for the great musicians. It opens the door to understand levels of music. It gives you some friends as well. And however you are in that, I mean, if your aspiration is to be a pro musician or concert guitarist and all that, it'll be very hard for you. There's nothing like playing in a small band with other people, you know, making music. It's just is an experience. And I think music has so much to offer us. You know, we give scholarships to musicians to do MBAs here, and they are some of our best students. They're rock stars, you know, or investigative journalists who put their life on the line to try and fight corruption. We give them scholarships to the MBA, or comedians, or we've had hip hop artists, reggae artists. It's amazing how good these people are, because they don't think they're academic, but they've been working and hustling and managing life for so long and know so much that when you structure that with some good knowledge taught the proper way, it empowers them to become leaders. So I love music, although I'm not playing much at the moment. That's something I do. I used to love doing aerobatic competition. Again, that's a lot of fun. But it's very pure.
Aircraft.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And so it's a very pure art, and it looks very scary and dangerous, but it's not. Well, it is, but you progress it, and it's very clinical in its shapes and lines, and it's very interesting to try and paint your aircraft in the sky like that and have the purity and balance of doing routines. And it's yeah, it's a pure thing. I love doing education design, and I love teaching, but teaching is wrong. I love being part of a group of people who are exploring a concept, a subject. And my area is strategy. So I've always thoroughly enjoyed, trying to build strategists and not teach strategy, which is quite a different thing. Those are some things, and my family, of course.
And your family, and I guess, what would your children say about you in terms of the coolest part of you as a dad?
I don't think there's very much cool about me and my kids' idea of a dad. I think we love each other. I don't know really. Maybe when they see me in my gowns on an academic presentation or something, or we go walking in the bush in the Kruger Park together with wild with the lions and elephants around. I think the fact that we do those sort of things probably. When I cook a decent meal or something, who knows? Or when I'm nice to my wife, when I'm particularly nice to my wife, I think they probably think that's very cool. So I'm going to try and do more of that, of course. Yeah. But I think they're very good kids. I think they're children who are learning that not to be too pretentious and to build their way in life. I think it's very hard to raise kids, and I wish I knew how to do it better, but we're certainly trying.
Yeah. Shifting to a character that we both have a lot of admiration for, Nelson Mandela, could you share with us a particular moment in time where something about Mandela's life or leadership or legacy really, struck a chord? Can you take us back to that moment? Where were you? What was the context?
I think so many things with Mandela that for me and for you, I know, because I know that you have a huge passion and love for Mandela's work and the person and the inspiration. I think there's something about his anger that inspires me, that he would be willing to be outspoken in high stakes situations and take on the possibility of being deeply unpopular, even hated, for a cause with his opponents, would do it in such a way that the quality of his purpose was clear, and it wasn't about his egotistic anger. I mean, Nelson Mandela, I imagine he was a very interesting and mixed man. I mean, there are some people say very negative things about him now because they don't like the way he did the transition, and they suggest he sold out to white monopoly capital or whatever. Other people would think differently. Sure. I'm a Dietmar, but I like the fact that he would be angry in that way, and of course, just the mere fact that he could play and be joyful. I'm very lucky to know some people from the Johnny Clegg band, which I don't suppose you necessarily know in the States. But they're really lovely people. And Barry Van Zyl, the drummer, is actually, he got a scholarship and did extremely well on the MBA, studying his strategy on his drums, touring the States. Is a very good musician, and he was probably one of our best ever research students, remarkable, with no business background. And they were on stage in, I think, where was it? Paris, I think, probably Paris. And it was Barry's first, he tells the story, his first ever gig as a Johnny Clegg drummer. So he was trying to do it. And then Johnny Clegg was singing, and they sang that song, Asim Bonanga, that lovely, powerful song about Mandela in exile. And then after singing it, then what happened? Mandela walked out on stage, smiling like this, being helped out, and sang with them and got the audience, said, sing, sing. And it was just that magic of that moment of him lifting a crowd through music with music. And this was not a man who was trying to be a glorified prophet or anything. It was a man. He was a human, being human, and yet a leader. And I think the greatest thing about him is that in that great leadership was just a person, just somebody that you or I could relate to as a as a decent person, a whole person with many aspects to him. It was just that he wasn't filtered. He wasn't hiding behind facades. He was himself. And I think that aspiration to be fully active and fully yourself is a really powerful one. And you are going to get a lot of pain if you're going to be in that position. But the payoff for that is way beyond it, because of course you're going to get a lot of purpose and a lot of sense of doing something worthwhile in your life, which I think he got a lot of. I'm sure he went through a lot, but that moment for me was, what is your most compelling moment, Anne, if I may ask you? I know you're interviewing, but I'm curious.
No, I actually, like you, there are many, but I think for me the most powerful moment, it was in 2003. We were celebrating 10 years of democracy in South Africa, and I had been invited by a very dear friend of mine who went on to become my business partner to come to a business event at the Johannesburg Country Club down in Auckland Park. It was, Women's Month, August 2003. And he then, in his true style, he just said, keep up your good work. We need more people like you doing this work and leadership, not only for South Africa and our continent, but for the world. So it was just remarkable. And that moment lives with me every day.
And it sounds like that's really inspired you and makes you do the current work you're doing now, and these sort of interviews and things. Because why? You want that image of Mandela, or that quality of Mandela to be understood or practiced, or?
Well, John, I think, I think we're in this global pivotal moment where we have existential chaos, conflict, and crisis. And I think that having lived through the trauma of South Africa and lived through the transformation, which was not straightforward and easy, but, delivering the impossible. And I think that if we are to deal with the current big threats of this time, I think that, so much of the military and the industrial world has created an incredible sense of abundance and wealth for the world. But to deal with these big threats in this moment in time, we need to give the world a more human face. And I think that apart from just the humanity of it, I think there is, as a former, headhunter, as who co-founded and ran one of the top, internationally aligned executive search firms, bringing this professional industry approach around what kind of leadership blueprint is going to crack it, in today's times. I truly believe Mandela's blueprint is the future of leadership. I really believe that. And if we have a look at, the impossibility of so many of the threats we're facing today, we need a different way of thinking, and we need a different way of acting and a different way of leading. And I think it's not just about Mandela, it's about the forefathers of the ANC, and it's about how Mandela and his humanity really not only changed a nation, he inspired the world, and there was a global collective movement that got behind the anti-apartheid movement. So I think that history has shown us what is possible, and I think Mandela and his example of leadership and his blueprint really is an empirical case of hope for the world today.
I love the way you talked about the idea of a movement, because I mean, you asked earlier what is a leader, and perhaps for me, building on what you just said, it's the person who creates a movement rather than an institution. It's you get inside, people move, that the movement happens, and so somehow makes that idea move forward, tells a different story that unites, we would hope in the end, hundreds of millions of people towards a new direction. That sounds impossible, but surely that is what we need. Somebody who can make these people move together voluntarily rather than compulsorily. And we've seen actions like Extinction Rebellion, for all its positive and negative press. That's an effort to make a movement. You're trying to create a movement around Mandela's ideas, which I think are a fantastic idea. So obviously, I would support that hugely. I mean, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, and I think we're in this twin pillar moment of despair and hope,
Hmm.
John, and and that's why I was so interested about what some things you were saying earlier, and how do we kind of navigate through these more difficult
Hmm.
times and moments, and it is about self-belief, and it is about something greater than ourselves. But I think even in these troubled times, and troubled waters, there is an empirical case of hope. And I think, the victory for Mandela and for South Africa really was a global victory. And I think the world really needs that today, because if we have a look at some of these big threats, I know you're a conservation lover, if we think of climate change, and if we have a look at, what's happening in the world, we're in a world on fire right now. These are challenges that go way beyond populist
Hmm.
nationalist borders. We are not going to solve these problems with a populist nationalism mindset.
No,
And
no
the
one.
global collective movement that Mandela and his forefathers inspired really is the kind of collective leadership movement that we need to deal with the current existential threats of this time, in my humble opinion.
Oh, I think it's inspiring opinion. That's inspiring. I love the way you express that. I mean, I often think that, people say, oh, Mandela's gone and that's the end of that. But I mean, what's the point of a life like that if the person is gone? Didn't Mandela and other great leaders leave tiny bits of themselves and everybody to nourish? The gift was a seed of that, which he would have learned from somewhere else. So surely we've got to have the guts to try and build that. Um, and not try and be some sort of heroes. It's just he was a very human person, and that's what inspired people. There was a sense of,
Absolutely.
well, I could do
Absolutely.
some of that,
Yeah, yeah. And
amazing.
I love what you shared about, his moment of anger, because I think a lot of people have a fear around, it's perceived as a negative emotion very often. And yet, there is a role for all of these, for every emotion. And I loved what you shared about his moment of anger and his courage around that, because
Hmm.
very often anger is a great important signal to people. But you're right, he revealed that humanity about him, and I guess I have you've evoked my own feelings about him, but I'm curious to hear as a dean and a director of a top business school, in your honest view, do you think there is a role for Mandela's leadership in the world today? Do you think it's still relevant?
No, I don't think it's at all. I think when you attach leadership to a person, it's a useful code. I mean, the point of lead, it's got to be catching, hasn't it? I mean, so
Yeah.
an idea is something that should catch and live people and make and put people into action. And so great leaders are often codified through religions or movements or books or whatever. They don't necessarily translate always into action. So I think there is a huge role for the type of leadership that Nelson Mandela exemplified. And I think having that example to illustrate that sort of leadership is hugely important. But making it just about Nelson Mandela is a big mistake. It's a very good
Yeah.
way to get people to understand it. It's a story. And Yuval Noah Harari, when he writes the books, he talks about the meta narratives in life that millions of people surround, whether this ism or a religion, whatever. We need something new that brings people together. So I think there's a lot to be said. There's a lot of qualities in that need to be explored. But let it not just become about Mandela, because time and age will make him into an iconic figure, and the vitality of that may lapse. How do
Sure.
we how do we take that into young people and to
Yeah.
link it with new ideas and take the common threads and demonstrate them? And I suppose the only way for leadership to spread, it's through example. And it'll spread as an idea, but it won't spread into action without example.
Of
And
course.
so I question myself, what example am I showing? And sometimes I show a terrible example of leadership. Sometimes I show a good example of leadership, and I'm sure we're all the same. But it's
Yeah.
understanding the times you do it badly, I think, that matter. And I'm quite sure that Mandela, with his 27 years of reflection and his times of dealing with himself, would have been through a lot of issues in himself. And we know he went through a lot in himself. and yet he was able to come through that. And it's that kind of pervasive sense of being activist, being engaged and human, and not being, glorious or vainglorious, and just doing it in the sense that life was worth living. That's so catching about him. And we need more of that. We need more leaders like that. We don't need leaders who are cynical and divisive. I mean, they'll create a faction, but they won't really move us all towards something that we can achieve. Having any perfectionist ideas are a terrible thing for a leader to have, because perfectionism is a quite unachievable thing. Perfectionism is so attracting that to yourself makes a myth. No, I think we have to try. If Mandela means anything, we have to try out what he taught us. We can't just worship it. We have to act it, because after all, that's what he wanted, isn't it? He wanted the world to be different. Scary.
Often that comes with great opportunities as well.
Yeah.
The size of the challenge and, how scary it is also denotes that it's a big enough challenge, But in our final moments, John, just any, I mean, you've shared such wonderful pearls of wisdom. Any other final thoughts around leading boldly into the future? Just, any kind of concluding comments?
I admire so many people who are taking example, who lead. There are so many people one picks that up from. I can't, I can only say what attracts me. I would hate to be an example of anything. I don't think I ever will be, but I can say what I think we ought to do, as far as I understand. So the first thing is that, it's good to learn about leadership in the abstract and then try and practice it. But the trouble with that is it doesn't tell you how to transition the hard times. And real leadership is a continuing movement through difficult circumstances. And a great leader I knew, who said, make reality your friend. And to make reality your friend is a really hard thing to do, because what is reality? And we see the world as we are, not as it is. That's one of the useful metaphors, I think. And so you have to understand this reality is different from ours. So I think great leaders are always seeking for contrary opinions, different views, but only in the process of doing things. And I mean, there are leaders who are leaders of thought only, and some of those are fantastic. But the sort of leaders we get in business or in the world and politics, they're trying to make things move on. And sometimes the complexities of doing really big challenges make people look like they're doing nothing. But every leader, if they're going to be leader, needs to emulate the fact that I'm doing something, I'm trying to make something different, I'm putting myself out there, and attract criticism. There's a great thing about leaders. If you are going to be a leader, I think you are going to get criticized, sometimes very rightly and sometimes very unfairly. I think being able to absorb that and walk through it and grow through it is probably the strongest characteristic for leadership. So if you keep doing that, you're going to get somewhere. Try, get hurt, understand it, move forward, try again. And while you might have the ups and downs, that pathway on average is always upwards. And all lives end, so we know that's going to happen. But then you will push the life on and have the sense of doing something worthwhile. So I think we have a really big calling now to do our jobs well, to do your jobs fairly, to use money well, to consider the impact on the environment, on species, to think about fairness and prosperity rather than just profit and inequality, to never think that you can get rid of those things. You can't not get rid of corruption. It's always going to be there. But what is the appropriate balance to make a satisfactory way forward? And to be surprised by Ukraine or by this or by that is to be in a sort of denial about the nature of the world. Those things will happen. And so how do we all give resilience to the people around us to follow on and have that optimism you talked about, that is not some dreamy optimism, but an optimism that sustains itself in the face of quite a lot of challenges and quite a lot of things you don't want to happen in your life, but you still know that life is somehow worth living. Love exists, music exists, nature exists, happy moments exist. And I don't know, and then you carry on trying. And that's probably the best you can do, and take lots of advice. These are not world-shattering bits of advice, and people don't want to hear them anymore. They want to have the 5 models of this, or some great complex idea. But world has always moved through human beings who are driven by a sense of purpose about humanity and the world around us, and that's what we have to do. And and we can. And the point is, we can. We all can.
Yes. Yes.
We all can. And so just keep trying wherever you're at, and see what you will make some progress, more than likely than not. That's a hard enough journey. I remember listening to John Kabat-Zinn once talking about meditation.
Yeah.
He's from up the road with you. I think he's Harvard, isn't he, or whatever. And he was teaching some people. So he said, well, breathe in and breathe out, and do that for 20 years, and then you'll get somewhere. And it's a bit like leadership, breathe in, breathe out, try again, learn, try, keep that up for 20 years, and see where you go. Don't limit yourself, and allow yourself to go in unexpected directions, because that's probably what's calling you from inside. Your brain might rebel, but if you have that calling, take the risk and go with it. Really do, because it's probably something that's really going to help a lot of people and yourself if you do.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's
John,
my motherhood for the day. I'm so sorry, But
no, not at all. I mean, you're a living legend of somebody who goes, in the unexpected direction. And, I think Henley and the African continent are lucky to have you. And just thank you for sharing those very candid, authentic, honest thoughts and wisdom.
Frankly, when I was listening to you, I was really inspired. So I think the best part of this interview has been your bit. So thank you very much for that. That was absolutely marvelous. I really appreciate it. And I'm inspired by the work you do. Thank you for doing it.
Talking to my good friend, John Foster Pedley, Director and Dean of Henley Business School Africa and Board Chair of the Association of African Business Schools, helps us rethink about this concept of tragic optimism, which the world-acclaimed Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl illuminated in his 1946 best-selling book, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist and neurologist, helps us answer some big questions, like how do we find optimism amidst tragedy? Tragedies like losing a loved one, losing one's livelihood, dealing with a difficult diagnosis like cancer, or suffering the hardships of Mandela's 27 years in prison, or Viktor Frankl's 3 years in Nazi concentration camps. Frankl first formulated the foundation of his existential approach to psychotherapy before World War II. However, it was the harsh realities and daily brutalities in those Nazi concentration camps, coupled with meaningful, magical moments, that really put his theory to test in practice. In times of tragedy, we often ask ourselves questions like, how do I make sense of this? How did this happen? Why now? And why me? It begs the question, what is Frankl's definition of tragic optimism? He defined it as our search for meaning in times of tragedy that give us the motivation and the will to live through it. It is premised on his belief that our search for meaning is a primary motivation in life. So, in times of tragedy, how do we transcend that tragedy and find tragic optimism? What did Viktor Frankl and others do to find purpose in those Nazi concentration camps? Subsequent researchers have highlighted a number of different strategies, and today I will share 3 of those. Firstly, they use creative distractions. They kept themselves distracted, meaningfully distracted, and entertained by creatively finding ways for children and artists to paint, for actors to perform, and for musicians to improvise and play uplifting music. The second strategy were acts of kindness and service to others. Viktor Frankl gave public talks, much needed talks to fellow prisoners on topics like medicine and psychotherapy. He and his team ran suicide prevention programs, and he helped depressed prisoners with logotherapy to find meaning and purpose in their lives, thinking about people, loved ones, something or someone they could live for. The third were meaningful spiritual connections. Frankl, in the gas chambers, was instructed by the guards to pick up the jacket of a deceased prisoner. He found a prayer in the pocket of that jacket, and that prayer, that message to him, became a meaningful spiritual connection. It was a message to him to live and practice what he wrote and preached. It was also a message for him to rewrite the book, Man's Search for Meaning, which had been taken from him during his time in Auschwitz. That prayer, that message, that spiritual connection kept him alive. In my own young life, my late mother imprinted this concept when she said to me, "And with every adversity in life, there is meaning and opportunity." That opportunity typically presents itself somewhere in the messy middle, but the difference between winners and losers are those who find that meaning and opportunity and travel north, and those who stay stuck in despair and travel south. Viktor Frankl's theory was dramatically tested in a life amidst tragedy in those concentration camps. His internment, the untimely loss of his wife Tilly, and the passing of his 81-year-old father Gabriel. But it was amidst those tragedies and tragic optimism that gave birth to a whole new school of existential psychotherapy called logotherapy. Despite the critics, Frankl shaped modern psychological thinking. He went on to speak and teach at 200 universities. He published and authored 40 books in 50 languages and was awarded 29 honorary doctorate degrees. Viktor Frankl led an extraordinary life until his passing in 1997 at age 92. But it was the work in those Nazi concentration camps, man's search for meaning, and tragic optimism that lives on and captured the hearts and minds of theorists, of practitioners, of researchers, and everyday people worldwide. You too have the motivation, the will, and the power to find meaning amidst any tragedy, to transcend that tragedy and find tragic optimism, and to achieve a positive outcome no matter what the circumstances in life, in leadership, and in our chaotic world. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making meaningful, bold choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time, one step for you, but like Viktor Frankl, a giant step for humanity. Take care and take meaningful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, Sign up on ann-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.